Have you ever noticed how one disappointment, even a relatively small disappointment, can completely derail your day, change your mood, perhaps send you down a spiral of negative thinking, maybe making you want to just sort of give up and why bother anyway? Well, the emotion of disappointment is incredibly powerful, and we don't actually talk about it that often. It's an everyday emotion, and it doesn't seem to get the headlines that anger or grief or depression might get. But I actually think that it can be at the root of a lot of emotional dysregulation. And I believe that by understanding disappointment, what's happening in your body, what's happening in your brain, and the cycle that it can lead to, I think it can really help you regulate your emotions, feel more contentment, and feel better about yourself. So by the end of today's video, you'll understand disappointment and the cycle that it creates for you. And you'll also walk away with some very practical tools about how to cut that cycle, how to have disappointment not be overwhelming. And you might also learn to recognize disappointment as the root of a number of other emotions. So let's start with a definition of disappointment. So, disappointment is sadness or displeasure when your expectations aren't met. Basically, there's a gap between what you expected or what you hoped for, what you wanted, and what turns out. It happens that moment when you realize that reality isn't matching your desires and sometimes your needs. But when we think of that, we don't really think about how painful that actually is for us. And I'm going to give you some information on the neurobiology so you'll understand a little bit more why it's so painful. And then I also want to talk about what happens when we're kids and we're disappointed and how the authority figures in our life respond to us, which can create a pattern for us of whether we internalize or externalize disappointment, how resilient we are, which pathway disappointment leads us down. And disappointment almost never shows up alone. It usually comes with frustration and irritation, sometimes anger at ourselves or at somebody else, sadness and hurt. Very often we feel hurt when we are unable to get what we want or need. And it also brings up shame and embarrassment. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that, but I also think it's critically important to understand. Disappointment is a very vulnerable emotion, primarily because it says, I wanted that. I wanted that and I didn't get it. And for some reason, saying that makes us feel very exposed, very unworthy. And as most of you know, I worked as a psychotherapist for 20 years. And in that work, as well as in the online coaching programs that I have, I realized that people really feel a lot of shame when they're asked to express out loud what they really want in life. And I know this personally because it came up for me the very first time that I was asked that question. It's kind of like, what do you really want in life? And it felt embarrassing to say it. It's very vulnerable to be like, I want this. I want it to look like that. And I think it brings up feelings of maybe I'm ungrateful. Maybe I should be grateful for what I already have. Who am I to think that I could have something like that? I shouldn't be wanting it, right? It brings up all sorts of stuff. So then when we get disappointed, we are in essence saying, hey, I cared about that thing. And now I'm feeling hurt, sad, angry, all sorts of emotions because I didn't get it. So disappointment is a signal to us of what we want or of what we wanted, right? And I will come back to that point because all of our emotions are information for us that can be very useful. But understanding how vulnerable disappointment can make us feel can help us to regulate that emotion because we can look into it more deeply and question some of our assumptions, okay? So let's talk about the cycle that disappointment creates. And as I go through this, you might want to jot down for yourself what the cycle is for you. I'll be giving some examples, and it's helpful for you to begin to think through, how does this work for me? And if you don't have anything to jot this down with right now, no problem. You can just come back to it. But basically, disappointment starts with an event that doesn't match your expectations, desires, or wants. And for some people, that mismatch will immediately create physical feelings, a sinking in the stomach, a feeling that the rug was pulled out from under you, a deflation, right? Our bodies can even reflect being deflated. For some people, it might be more of a feeling of tension. So, the emotions that can go with these, if you feel a lot of tension, the emotion that can come up right away could be irritation, frustration, anger. If you get that feeling that the rug is pulled out from under you, that could be shock. That feeling in the pit of your stomach could be simply the disappointment, or it could be sadness. And the reason I want you to be aware of your own cycle is that sometimes people are first aware of the physical feelings, but others are first aware of the other emotional feelings. And a different group of people might be first aware of the thoughts that the mismatch in that event happening, the mismatch, creates negative thinking. So you basically have this event, and boom, immediately it creates feelings, physical and emotional, or thoughts. Now, the thoughts could be negative thinking about yourself, or it could be negative thinking about others. So your brain interprets the event, and the brain interprets that mismatch between what you expected and what actually happened. It turns it into a story. And very often, that story is driven by your negative core beliefs. If you have a negative core belief of, I'm unworthy, the story will be, well, you didn't deserve this, you're unworthy, you're not good enough. If your negative core belief is, I can't count on others, well, this just reinforced that, right? So I have a number of videos on the negative core belief, and understanding which yours is and why it developed is super important. I'm going to come back to that towards the end today. But in the meantime, I do want you to know that I have a free PDF called Transform Your Negative Core Belief. And I'll show it here on the screen with a QR code, and the link will be in the description to this video. So you can download that. It helps you understand which of those beliefs is truly at your core. And it gives you a handful of techniques to begin to rewire those beliefs. But basically, the way your brain interprets the mismatch is going to tie to those pre existing negative beliefs. And all of that ties to early childhood stuff. I'm going to get there in just a moment. So, in this cycle, which is basically based on the cognitive behavioral therapy cycle, when an event happens and we interpret it and it creates thinking, that thinking loops back and affects how we feel. It also impacts how we behave. And similarly, all those feelings that came up impact how we think and how we behave. And so all of that can spiral. And then the behaviors that very often come from disappointment can be future avoidance, avoiding taking any risk because you don't want to feel that disappointment again. And if you're avoiding taking reasonable risks, then you're avoiding doing those things that can help you move you to where you want to be. So then that creates more disappointment in the future. And it actually begins to wire our brain in a way that avoiding disappointment becomes the biggest thing we focus on. And our world can get more and more restricted, more and more, constricted, right? It gets smaller and smaller. Other behaviors might be to lash out. If one of your habitual patterns is anger, you might get angry and then lash out at loved ones, which pushes them further away, makes the situation worse. Or you maybe just go into a spiral of lashing out at yourself, and those negative core beliefs get more and more ingrained. Okay? This is not a good cycle. I want to help you shift it, understand it, and shift it. So, before we talk about what happens in childhood that creates a lot of this cycle, I want to talk about the neurobiology of the brain very briefly, because it really helps to emphasize that the deep and significant pain of disappointment is actually happening in the chemical reaction in our brain. So, deep in our brains, there is an ancient evolutionary part of our brain called the lateral habenula. Now, you can think of this part of the brain as the disappointment hub, but this part of the brain lights up when an anticipated reward doesn't materialize. So, that feel good chemical that you've heard talked about, dopamine, it actually kicks in when we are anticipating a pleasure, when we are anticipating something good. So, before an event, that chemical can kick in, but when that reward isn't realized, the lateral habenula releases two other neurotransmitters. One is glutamate and the other is GABA. So glutamate it's an exciting sort of chemical. It revs us up. It amplifies the signals we're receiving. And GABA is inhibitory. GABA slows things down. GABA dampens signals. So they sort of have opposite effects, but they're released at the same time. And the ratio of how much of each is released, that ratio impacts how disappointed we feel. So the ratio between these two chemicals is kind of the dimmer switch on how disappointed we feel. If we release a lot more glutamate compared to GABA, it's like turning that switch up. Our disappointment goes up. If we release more GABA, then we're lowering that dimmer switch. So that's why sometimes we can handle disappointments no problem, and other times they feel really devastating. And given that dopamine floods our system when we're just anticipating something, when that mismatch happens, the dopamine levels can plummet, which gives us that sinking feeling and that real sadness. And as I'm saying this, I'm thinking sometimes people feel like, wow, even though the event met my expectations, I still feel a little sad because the dopamine doesn't always continue to kick in. So, just a little bit of an aside there. But what happens if we regularly experience a lot of disappointment and we have a strong reaction to that disappointment, which would be contributed to by that negative cycle we talked about, right? When you have a lot of that, your brain can learn to stop anticipating good things. If wanting something leads to pain, I better not want anything at all. And this actually causes a rewiring in the brain where that dopamine cycle dampens, and we neurologically actually kind of withdraw from motivation and we withdraw from anticipation. So, not to get too bummed out here, because the good news is we can rewire the brain. Our brain learns and our brain changes throughout our whole lives. And with the right guidance and the right effort, you can begin to rewire that pattern. So, don't want you to lose hope here. So, let's turn to childhood. And as we do this, I want to encourage you to look at the patterns from your childhood as if it's a fact finding mission, not a fault finding mission, because it's much more productive to really look at this as, why did I develop these patterns? So you can have empathy towards yourself without immediately going to a blame. All right. So let's think about a 2-year-old. Now, I'm sure many of you have spent time with 2-year-olds. And if you think about it, those 2-year-old tantrums are almost all about disappointment. They're almost all about that 2-year-old wanting something or wanting to do something that they either can't get or they're not allowed to do. It is a disappointment mixed with a frustration, and it is an unbelievably powerful emotion. It is so powerful that the 2-year-old ends up on the floor, screaming and banging their fists. And this is a really challenging stage for parents. I don't know any parent who does this stage perfectly, but some do it adequately and others maybe don't. But it is a universal stage. So it is so instinctual, right? It's so basic to us. And when you think about it this way, I think you can sort of understand how common this is and how much power this emotion that we rarely discuss has. So many parents will try to calm the child, which is good, right? But often we do that with sort of like brushing away the disappointment. Oh, don't be so disappointed. We'll do such and such tomorrow. This can be really frustrating for a parent because it could be like the kid could be hugely upset. You promised to take them to the park and there's like a thunderstorm happening. You can't take them to the park. But the child doesn't understand that they don't have any perspective. So the fact that a parent tries to bring in perspective makes sense. But if this pattern of sort of dismissing the upset of the child continues, that child will learn this is an emotion I'm not supposed to have. The child won't feel seen or heard. And worse, sometimes a parent might totally withdraw from the situation, which is very threatening to a toddler. Toddlers are, even children, young children, are completely dependent on their caregivers. And if the caregiver withdraws physically or emotionally, that's very threatening to that child's survival emotionally. And other parents might get really angry and lash out. So, thinking through how your disappointments were handled can really help you understand how you feel about that emotion right now. And then also, I want to talk about the parents who kind of panic when their child is disappointed. They might panic and get really anxious and try to jump in and fix it right away. They might even give in to whatever it was, right? Yeah, okay, take the kid outside in the storm, right? Whatever it was, the parent might panic and try to get the kid not to be so upset. But that as well teaches us that this is a really anxiety provoking emotion and that it is an emotion. If that emotion is scary to my caregiver, wow, that's really scary. So, comment below if this makes sense and if you know the pattern of how you were responded to when you were disappointed, which again, completely natural state, happens a lot, very frequent, and you learn from how you were responded to. And then as you got a little bit older, you might have begun to be aware of your parents' disappointments. And if disappointment was such a horrible, scary emotion when you had it, you immediately will think it's a horrible, scary emotion for them to have, and they might respond that way too. And you may develop a feeling of, I'm a disappointment to my caregivers. It could also be, I'm a disappointment to my teachers, to my siblings, and that eventually will lead to an internalized negative belief, I'm a disappointment. So I think you can see why this video is as long as it is, because this is a very complex emotion that really impacts us. And then even later in life, as we grow up and move away from our parents, other people have a hard time with our disappointment, and we have a hard time with theirs. So when somebody is disappointed, we all jump in right away. We want to make them feel better. We want to say, oh, it's not so bad, or oh, you'll get it next time, right? We want to whitewash the pain. So if you find yourself in that situation, doing that to somebody else who's disappointed, maybe just slow down, take a moment, and be like, wow, totally understand why you're disappointed. That's really hard. And let them sit with it. And if you practice doing that for others, you might also, and maybe you already can do that. So I'm not judging here. You might already be able to do it. But if you can do it for others, you can then begin to do that for yourself. So the practical guidance, number one, relates to what I just said, which is an acceptance and acknowledgement of the emotion that you're having. Acknowledge that you're disappointed. Let yourself take a minute to feel it without having to fix it. And I know this always sounds counterintuitive to people, but our emotions ebb and flow. They don't ever stay exactly the same. And generally, when we push away or try to whitewash or cover up an emotion, it gets stronger and stronger. Whereas if we just sit with it and we feel it and we think, okay, where do I feel this in my body? What is it I'm thinking? What thoughts is this bringing me to? What if I just sit here with the physical feelings and let them be for a second? And with this awareness and acknowledgement, bring in some diaphragmatic breathing. Let your inner body, like let your physiology know that you're okay. This may not feel good. It might hurt. You don't like it, but you're okay. So your body can begin to respond to it with more calm, with more of that GABA. And you can contribute to that with your own emotional regulation tools. The second thing to do is to really become intimately aware of that cycle, what you feel in your body, what emotions you're feeling, what thinking you're having, and how those all, behaviors as well, sorry, how those all interact with each other. And once you have a true awareness of your cycle, you can figure out where's the easiest spot to intervene. And in general, we cannot directly change our feelings other than by simply sitting with them, but we can't do something to make them change. What we can do is question our thinking, begin to think about things differently, or change the behaviors. So, the third thing I want to give you today is to pick a behavior that does not go with your typical downward spiral and practice engaging in that behavior. So, behavior is actually the most dramatic way to begin to change the wiring in our brains. So, a challenge for you could be to pick something that you've been avoiding because you are afraid of that disappointment. And it could be something small, it doesn't have to be a major thing. And just go for it, do it, see what happens. Approach it as if it's a scientific experiment. It could be applying for an opportunity you've been avoiding. It could simply be texting a friend that you've been afraid to text because you're worried that they won't respond the way that you want them to. It could be to share an idea that you have with somebody, and you've been avoiding that because you're worried that they won't like the idea. So these could be small things, but pick one and go for it. Now, as I wrap up here, my other videos on emotional regulation skills will be really helpful for this. So, just thinking about disappointment as one of those core emotions that can really set you down a negative cycle, you can maybe begin to think about it differently so that you bring in those emotional regulation tools simply for disappointment, which is one of my friends said, that's an everyday emotion. We feel that all the time. All right. I really hope this was helpful. Make sure to check out that PDF. I also have a free webinar called Rewire Your Brain, and it goes a little bit more into how our behaviors can help to rewire some of these patterns we've developed. Make sure you're subscribed so you will see the next video on this topic. Okay, let me know what you think. Let me know the questions you have, and I'll see you next week.